Have you ever found yourself oversharing? This week on Carlie's Couch, we explore true connection, the difference between venting, trauma dumping, and oversharing, and ways to practice better discernment.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to Carlie's Couch. I'm Lextopia. And
I'm CC Fierce.
This is CC Fierce / Carlie Carpio. First.
That North Carolina don't ever come, or that's Tennessee probably, the way you're sounding. That's that Memphis in that blood.
That was Memphis. Yeah, that was a little Memphis. CC First.
That don't ever come out, but y'all caught
That's
it.
funny. No, and then over the weekend, one of my clients said, she caught me. She said, "Ooh, I heard a little." It was something I said, but sometimes the A's like passing the bag, or it's like something like real quick. It definitely comes out. That's funny. So you guys heard Carlie at the top of the episode say what we're talking about today. A lot of y'all need this. And so we are going to get into this topic of like oversharing and just understanding why it may not be in your best interest. Is that a good way to say it? I don't want to say it's not necessarily like a bad, good, but it's not always in your best interest. And it's something to at least be aware of, right? If we always talk about the importance of being intentional about things, it's like, okay, how do I speak and communicate with intention?
I love that. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it, and just how maybe it's not a bad thing, but how you can do better or have better relationships. It can lead to a better connection. So we'll start with no question of the week this week. But Lexi, have you ever had a problem with oversharing?
No.
Nice.
Not nice.
Good for you.
So not like a no, like a never happened ever type
Some
no.
people listening like,
But a no like not really, like, because I already don't share but so much, you know what I mean? And so even with close relationships, it's not, I mean, you may say differently, like, or people who know me might say something differently, but in general, I already don't share that much. What I will say though is the times that I do a little bit is always going to be connected to times of like a high emotions, like I'm super frustrated, angry. That's when I say things that I regret saying, and not like mean necessarily, but like if I say things that I didn't really need to say there, or I'm just trying to evoke an emotion or something, right? Where I'm not intentional with my speech, but I wouldn't call that oversharing, like, and like saying too much about myself or a situation.
I wouldn't call you an overshare. I would actually say you're very intentional and calculated with what you share and when you share things. But I will say I used to be a super oversharer.
Not super.
Man, but only because like the way I grew up, like my mom was like that. And it just like emotions like leak out. Like you don't really like care who hears it or whatever, or whatever with the person. You just gonna share a thing. And then I just noticed when I shared like something like that was, pretty traumatic or whatever, talking about growing up around domestic violence and stuff, with somebody in college, and I was like, oh, that was an overshare. I shouldn't have said that shit.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you to follow that up with that.
I was like,
you knew immediately.
As soon as I said it, I was like,
they did not need to know about those medical records.
Can I bring that back? No.
So you saying that, then, can you explain to the listeners, so what do you consider an overshare? Because I want to make sure that to say like, oh, I used to super overshare. What does that mean you were doing?
So what actually inspired this episode is I have a friend who, she's like a level 1 friend, like entry level. She just passed acquaintance, but she's real cool. But she overshares. And I thought about it because she texted me after I was listening to a conversation, and then she started going real deep into something. And I was like, oh, why is she telling me this right now? Like, oh, this feels like a lot. Like, it felt very awkward for me as a receiver. But I'm still holding space, and I'm very empathetic. So I was able to hold that space. But afterwards, she texted me and was like, hey, I'm so sorry. I'm an overshare. I'm really working on it. And I just feel like I might have did too much today. And I was like, yeah, I would be more intentional about what you're sharing. I was like, but I'm not mad that I was able to hold the space. I was like, but I just want to put that out there that not everybody will be able to hold that space. And I don't want you to overshare something and leave yourself in a space like where you could get hurt or where it feels like it's too much. So my definition is like, when you share past the bounds of a relationship or the situation, it could make the other person maybe uncomfortable or like learn too much about you. Like y'all don't really have that level of understanding for you to be sharing those things. And then there's always a caveat. It's like, but I feel like sometimes in conversations, things come up and you do end up sharing deep things randomly. Like you never thought that you would, but it fits and it's a vibe and they respond well. So thinking about oversharing as a place where they don't necessarily share that vibe with you, like they're not meeting you on that vibe.
It's like one-sided, and it doesn't fit the, I guess the confines or the boundaries of what the relationship you have is.
And the energy, they don't match you. Like it's
that's true. Some people, when regardless if they talk too much or whatever they're talking about, they don't recognize when you're like trying to back out or when you're not really engaged all the way, etc. So it sounds like it's an awareness. It sounds like a person who overshares may not be a good listener, or maybe just their desire or whatever's pushing them to speak overshadows.
I feel like their desire for connection is more than their like ability for awareness in the conversation, or maybe they just don't care and they actually are desiring connection more or wanting to share this hurt or pain or this thing more.
But I've experienced people who I wouldn't say constant overshares. Like nobody comes to mind for me that every time you talk to them they overshare. Of course there is levels of like maybe it's happened at times, and or for me, I think it's easy for me to think about people who talk like too much at a time where it's like I'm not really trying to hear all that. But it does make, I think it makes me feel bad because if it feels like they're oversharing, then for me that means that I'm not in a space to be receiving all this, or like I don't have the time / context or whatever it is to even do anything with what you said. And also if our relationship is not one where I feel compelled to hold space. It's going like in one ear and out the other anyway. And so to me, I'm going to be frustrated because I feel like my time's being a little bit wasted. And that sounds pretty mean, but like that's how it feels to me when people are like oversharing, because like wasting brain space. There's nothing I'm going to do with this information. I don't know what you're talking about, or I'm not in a space to help or whatever. And so it's just a little frustrating. And for those reasons, I probably would not spend a lot of time with somebody who it feels like they overshare things and are constantly going to be like an output. I don't necessarily spend the most time with people who are just in general, it's output. Like it's okay to like just chill or have a conversation or read the room for a conversation. And so that's draining. But all of that, again, I'm an introvert. And so conversation and exchange and all that is going to constantly pull my battery down. So for me, that does not power me up. And I don't want to be powered down by somebody that's not on my radar.
I think that's super important, and people don't like consider this is such a nuanced conversation, and so definitely announcing that as a thing. But I've known a lot of people in my life that are oversharers, and maybe because I was an oversharer, so I attracted a lot of that. But like I've had people in coffee shops randomly come up to me and start telling me their whole life story, and I've had like people in different spaces do that, and I'm happy when I have the space to hold it or to listen. But when I don't, I'm getting better with boundaries and like setting them. But one person that comes to mind is there used to be someone, I used to have a friend who would constantly overshare, and it was just that every time. It's like you knew, like if you knew if this person was going to be at a thing, it was Eeyore. They're about to like drag you down. You're talking about your battery going down, and it's like sucking the life out of a place because you just always have like something to talk about and say. And so that's what comes to mind for me. But then it goes into this whole thought of like, what's the difference? Like when we're talking about oversharing, there's levels. So there's like venting, there's oversharing, and then there's trauma dumping. And I want to be clear what we're talking about as we go through the episode. And so what is venting?
I would say that venting, the first things I think about, venting is you need to get something off of your chest and out of your mind. That's just, is something on your heart, whether you're stressed about something, whether there's an issue that you're thinking about, whether, and venting, I will say, also tends to have a negative in my mind. I think that's when it's something negative. It's not that I'm telling you all these good things. It's venting is I need to release this energy. And so it tends to be an exchange of things that are maybe weighing on your shoulders and negative. So it's a lot of times it could be people expressing something pent up, or it's not something that happens all the time, but maybe, again, like that teapot is so hot they have to like kind of let all these things out. And so that's something that I would say like happens from time to time with everyone, or Like, I could think of plenty of people who, they start venting, and sometimes, that's okay. Other times it may feel like an overshare, so it could be an overshare. But in general, I feel that venting is a little different because it doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't feel, no, it's understood. Like, I understand, when you get to space, that just means you need to talk to somebody, as opposed to an overshare. You may need to talk to somebody, but, like, you also should know that I might not be that person.
Yeah, I would say even with venting, it's important to ask if people have space before you just start like putting whatever, even if they're your best friend, even if they're whatever outside of your therapist, like you should ask about that. But oversharing is like known because it's excessive generosity with information about one's private life or the private lives of others. So I bet also, I didn't even contemplate this, but I bet a lot of people overshare about other people's lives.
Yeah, they do a lot. And adding that to the real definition of oversharing, now immediately a few other people come to mind. And even for myself, I can see like, oh yes, there's been times where I may have fell into that boat. So that is good to consider as well, because it'll be like, wasn't nobody even talking about that person? So like, why are you just bringing them into conversation? And a lot of times doing that is a problem because in some shape or form, we are bringing somebody else up because now that's kind of making us feel better, or we feel better about something. And so that's something to pay attention to for sure. What about trauma dumping?
Okay, so we have levels. So venting is like a one-time. Oversharing is like excessive, could be about your private life or somebody else's, things that people might not know or might not need to know. And then trauma dumping is the excessive sharing of personal traumas or distressing experiences, often in contexts that are not suitable or without the explicit consent of the listener. And so it's conversations that weigh you down. Like if you talk to a person and, it's just been one of those days, but every time you talk to them, it's one of those days. And every time you talk to them, they're reliving a certain situation or a certain thing, and it just feels heavy, and making the listener feel overwhelmed and perhaps powerless to even respond or support.
When I hear about trauma dumping, though, I think even more deep than just it's been one of those days people, because for me those are more so just like negative based people, because it's like always something going on, and they are probably trauma dumpers also, because to me a trauma dump is when it's like they're talking about their childhood stuff or, things that feel like you should be talking to somebody who really knows how to help you through those things or to walk you through those things. And again, never a bad thing to listen, especially if it's a friend trauma dumping on you. Like I think that can be a thing. And yet if we are not at that space, trauma dumping is very much like, to me, is that not an example of oversharing?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
I think it's just an extreme
what you're
example.
Oversharing.
Yeah, like what you're oversharing and the heaviness. So it's like if I'm oversharing about my friend's sex life or something, like that's not necessarily heavy. It might be weird, but it might not be heavy.
And that's just not nobody's business.
Exactly.
For you to be talking
but
about,
if I'm talking about like, like you said, childhood traumas and things, which we do need to talk about them. But if that's all you're talking about and it's consistent and you're talking to a bunch of different people about that same thing all the time, it's trauma dumping.
Mm-hmm. I have a question then for us to think about. We talked about oversharing as typically it's like information they don't necessarily need to know. Can you overshare positive information, do you think? It might annoy you if somebody seems like they're always like, I'm doing this and I did that and oh my gosh, this happened. But
I feel like I do that to you sometimes. Just be in the sense that like I'm chatting.
Well, what you do is you don't wait for me to ask about stuff. You just start saying it and I'd be like, dang, I didn't get a chance to like... Then if I ask, my mind is ready to receive. And then I'll be like, oh, okay. While I'm doing whatever I'm doing.
But in my head, like that, like, yes.
But that's not an overshare either, though.
Oh.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, my examples with anybody is nobody's, like, oversharing. They might talk a lot or in a certain way or something like that. But those aren't bad things. And oversharing, I thought we were thinking of that as negative. But I'm like, can you overshare something?
As a former negative overshare, or like, I've never been a trauma dumper, but definitely oversharing with personal things or things I'm like going through. I feel like yes, but I say that only because recently I had coffee with someone who actually, she might be on the podcast soon, but she also wanted to maybe work with Change the Tune. So we were just having coffee to get to know each other, and she was asking about stuff, and I was just sharing all this good stuff. But afterwards, I was like, dang, did I share too much? But she was asking, but I felt a little like, ooh.
Like did I do too much?
Yeah, like, did I share? But she was asking questions, so it was like, I'm answering your questions, honestly.
Then I feel like maybe no then, because maybe that feeling probably kind of comes from sometimes we want to be aware, and maybe we shouldn't need to, but sometimes we want to be aware that we don't come across a certain way, and or that we're used to other people sometimes seeing us talk positively about what's going on in our lives as they might down themselves because maybe we have done that, or, you see how that can happen. And so I think that's just being overly sensitive to the other people's securities. But again, if they were asking questions, I think then that would not be considered an overshare. So maybe not.
Yeah, maybe it's just being vulnerable. And so maybe that's the difference, right? So that was just me being vulnerable. And so learning how to do that without oversharing has been a journey that I'm on.
Yeah. One of the reasons, so any time I can think of for an overshare, and now that we've expanded the definition, thinking of like a couple little things here and there, I would say for me, most of the time that stems from impulsive moments. And because I've thought about it actually recently too. Anytime there is something, I'm like, oh, why'd I say that? Again, not really like an overshare, but like, something I was like, I didn't need to say that, or why did I say that? Those are moments where many times I'm like, oh, I was with a group of like my friends, and or maybe it's like, you want to juice the crowd or something, or it's just like you feel like you need to be in the mix. But there's some kind of insecurity there, I'm sure, and then impulsivity of like you just talk, like you just say stuff that you're like you wouldn't maybe really be saying if it was just like you and a person, or if it was a calmer conversation or space, etc.
Yeah, it definitely stems from like a need for connection.
Yeah.
So you said want to be in the mix, so a need for connection, seeking validation perhaps from different people, that impulsivity, but a lot of it is like that insecurity. Like I want to be validated. I want to feel connected. I want to feel loved or included right now. I think also some people might want sympathy.
And pity.
Yeah, and pity, for sure. Absolutely. Especially when people are doing the trauma dumping and sharing like really, hard things that happened.
And to that point too, when people do say things, overshare or not, I do try to still acknowledge what they say, or like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. And, it might not be a whole no deep conversation, but I'm okay. I think sometimes you can't recognize when they need, and maybe they don't know that's what they're fishing for.
For sure.
Because then as soon as you be like, oh no, like, which I feel like when I could tell somebody's fishing, I don't give them responses. I don't. And then, but when people are like really in a space and you like they're emotional, that's kind of different for me. And they do just need to kind of know that like you heard them, or maybe acknowledge that in some type of way. So, I mean, it's not a bad thing necessarily to acknowledge those feelings.
I don't think so. When I was doing research about like why people overshare and what can we learn from it? How can people have better discernment after we decided this would be an episode topic? They brought up in an article an interesting like phenomena that's solely based on like the internet and people oversharing. And so one of those was an online disinhibition effect, quotes and quotes, where the anonymity of the internet makes individuals feel freer to share their innermost thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment.
Yeah, and probably also without fear of actual actions being taken. Like, somebody's not going to punch you in the face if you say whatever you say online. And yet, I will say that there's starting to be a lot more actual consequences to people having said stuff and doing stuff online. A lot of kids that aren't, that are getting rescinded from their colleges and their scholarships. A lot of people getting fired from their jobs. And that's half the time of people being petty. And so it is important. And I would say a rule of thumb is like if you wouldn't say it in a room of people, not to say it online, and to be cautious about like what your style of posting and things is, and like if you try to deviate real quick for something, then that'll stand out as like, oh, this isn't like trying to be funny or whatever. So, yeah, I think you could kind of tell sometimes when people like pop out and are trying to be like super malicious, but a lot of times people, it's just like second nature how they speak in a certain way, and it's definitely something to be careful about.
Okay, so what's the line? So we know, like we discussed oversharing and venting and trauma dumping, but what's the line? Because the way we build relationships is being vulnerable. Like I was talking about, sharing even good things, but sharing pieces of ourselves with people is how we build connection. So how can we tell when it's genuinely connecting, and like maybe when to share stuff versus like when we might be oversharing?
Consider, like, do you feel vulnerable around everybody? Like, is it easy for you to be vulnerable with everybody? Because that's why it's so hard for me to answer from the other way, because like I already don't. So I would kind of think about the fact that, well, you might be a line stepper and you might be an oversharer if in general being asked that, you're like, oh yeah, I don't have a problem talking to anybody about anything. And it's like, well, maybe you kind of should. And or maybe that means you're the person who might need to pay a little more attention to how you're separating relationships. Because if there's no separation in the relationships in your life, then you may be an oversharer, and that may be somebody who habitually steps the line. If you feel like you're a person who has, oh, like, yeah, my work people here, like, I don't even like when people ask me, like, how was your weekend? Fine. Like, you don't need to know what I did. Like, and but I ask people questions, right? Like, even with my close friends, like Damo will come over. I'm going to ask Damo questions all day about work because I know he's going to keep talking, and then I don't have to talk about stuff. So, like, if you're a person who, there's differences in this person and how you talk to this person, how you talk to that person, then you may have a better understanding of vulnerability in relation to those relationships. I don't know if I even really answered it. It was more like making a bunch of statements.
Well, but that's a good thought. Like thinking about your own level of comfortability and vulnerability with sharing things with people and opening yourself up. So if you feel like you're just an open book to anybody who will listen, then maybe you're sharing with people who might not feel comfortable with that.
But I just remember what it was that you said earlier that I was thinking about too. But because there are times though that I will say something that it could have been considered an overshare, and even though I just met this person, because of what we're talking about or something they've said, and I can say something and it fits, like, and I'm not really sure how to actually explain or like define what that situation all looked like, but it fits. And that may come from them having shown vulnerability first, which is kind of what you do in conversation and communication. If people aren't vulnerable with you, most of the time it's you probably should start with a little vulnerability yourself. And again, there's levels though, right? So you wouldn't go from 0 to 100. But yeah, you kind of can match and listen and pay attention to how you're speaking to the person or how the person is speaking to you and how they're listening when you're speaking. Like, is the conversation going back and forth? Did they tell a story? You can tell your story, as opposed to like another thing, like you just talking. Like that's just not it. That's probably not the space.
Yeah. So first noticing your level of comfortability and vulnerability with people, matching the other person's energy. Like if you feel like it's all you, and not every conversation will be 50-50. Some will be you venting, but if it is, have you talked to them? Are they okay? Did they have enough space for you to do that? Have y'all had these type of conversations before? I think the most important things when thinking about oversharing, because it's such a nuanced line, but is the difference between venting versus like oversharing or trauma dumping is the intent and the impact on the listener. Like if they're leaving feeling overwhelmed or really heavy or like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, or helpless, then it was probably a vent or an overshare. And if you leaving feeling vulnerable and raw, like, why did I say that? It was probably an overshare. But thinking about your intention, and so your self-awareness, your intention, and then your impact on the listener as like a guiding light for, am I oversharing?
Yeah. Just at a conference the other day with Tatiana is so interesting because the topic of all of this is Black maternal health. And so, of course, there's so many people that have so many stories. And when she tells her story, she didn't even like telling this. She says this, I don't like telling the story anymore because every time she feels it, and every time she cries, and every time she like physically hurts thinking about how like she received obstetrical violence. Maybe that's the right word, but from her doctor. And but of course now telling a story, now everybody, like throughout the day, right, coming up, and I'm hearing, oh, and then this happened, and then this, and we're trying to do, and I see the draining of like, oh, it's going down and down and down, hearing that, and yet in those spaces, she knows like that's part of like what's going on, right? And also it was funny because then the next day and catching up on everything, it's like, yeah, today is my I'm a chill and cry day after a day like yesterday. And so keeping in mind that that does affect people. And when I'm talking to people, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of like, A, they don't care, or B, they're not listening, or C, it's like, you know, it's draining. And everybody's just not considerate, though, to think about how what they're saying is going to affect you, or the fact that maybe you just heard 20 other people's stories that were similar to this as well, which is why it's also hard work as a therapist, hard work in certain spaces and workers, social work, all of those things, right? Imagine like all of that being heard all of the time. And so I will say it's important to practice those social cues of saying like, I get it. I did something similar happened, without it even having to be like every little detail and or a lot on other people.
And that's a perfect segue. So I added this question. So Lexi, you work with people on their brand, on social media, on marketing. What's your take on what people should share online versus not? Like, that makes sense for Tatiana. She's advocating for these things. She's really, you know, a driving force in that. And so that's important for her to share her story whenever she feels like she can and hold that space for other people. But what about other people? Because, you know, the audiences and all the followers connect with stories. They want to connect with the person, but how do they know where to draw the line?
That's a really good question. The first thing I would say to think about is, why am I telling this story? Or why am I sharing this, rather? So, for example, we see all day now online, it's how you do things, a story about something that happened to you at work. It could be very traumatic. It could be something light. But it's like, why are you sharing this? And quite frankly, if the why is because this is buzzwordy, if the why is because there is some people, and I hate to sound like I'm not giving people the benefit of the doubt, but a lot of, for people like I know who are in some of those spaces, they really actually don't care about nothing, and it is just for views and just for reshares and just yada, 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 yada. You can tell when somebody is really talking about something that happened or a story as a way that might be healing for them, because it's actually kind of hard to talk about. And it's not, every post on their page is not about that. You know what I mean? Like, they're not, it slips in there. And so that's when I feel like a lot of times it's actually something real kind of going on. And then two, you're thinking about like, why am I saying this, or why am I talking about this? But like, two, what is it going to do for me to tell this story or to share this to people I don't know? I have cut down dramatically the amount of like back and forth type conversations that we used to have like online back in the day with people, because it's like, then you find out, I don't know these people. Like all these headlines come out about people, and it's like, oh, we're going back and forth, and it feels like you're friends and you're not. But it's like, what do you hope to get out of saying something? Because A, you'll see it backfire and people just making fun of you, and or B, they make whatever's going on even worse. Because people are petty, and because social media is entertainment. You are entertainment when you put your story out there. And so if your story is not entertainment, I would not put it out there. If your story is a genuine place of healing and something that you have / are processing, because if you have not healed around the thing, I wouldn't talk about it. If you are, then your focus of your story is kind of on how, like, wow, this thing has helped me get through this. Does that make sense? It's like, you tell a full story. I don't think people need to put all their stuff out there, because you're entertainment, like at the end of the day. And so think about everything you put out there. You have to not care about what happens with it. And certain things are too delicate for that. And certain things you may not be ready for what happens with that. And so all of that to say, I would keep things a little more light, keep things a little more base. And I would say to talk to your friends. And there's so many conversations, what I was saying earlier, that I don't have in real life anymore or online anymore, because I actually just have them in real life. And there are some things you could go to type and be like, I can actually put that in the group chat. Because now we can talk about it, laugh about it, cry about it, whatever it might be. But you need to remember, like, what real relationships are for. And not all of your stories are going to benefit you. Getting those clicks, it's not going to benefit you.
Thank you. Yeah, from someone who does this for a living. I thought that was important. And then that goes into how can we practice better discernment when sharing things with people online and in person. And a big piece is contextual awareness. So being aware of your situation, being aware of who you're talking to, what your audience is, considering your relationship, and like thinking about your intention. What do you want from this conversation? What are you trying to gain by sharing it?
And also when you're sharing and speaking, communicating in general, it's always good to take that pause. It's always good to try to speak more slowly, try to think before you speak. And that just keeps you from oversharing, and it keeps you kind of aware of the actual boundaries of the combo. It's not just impulsively just things coming out that now, if you want to take back, you don't have that opportunity.
Another one is to be mindful of your impact on others. So that self-awareness, reflect it back from other people, like the intention behind your words. Like, did you make the conversation feel really heavy? Not saying you shouldn't share things, but if it's always really heavy, that's a sign that there might be an issue there, and you might need to talk to someone who can actually help you work through a thing and put some actions behind it.
And like you said earlier, if you notice, you always say the same things when you talk to people. And sometimes that could be a very light thing. There's some people, like, every time I see them, they be like, "Yeah, how's that, da-da-da?" Or it'll be that one thing, right? And it'll be like something over where you met or something over whatever. And it's like, I don't know. Like, they just always say it. And I think it's important to understand that, that's because people want to connect, right? So when we do these things, it's because we want to connect, and there's nothing wrong with that. And be aware of and intentional of what you're saying, to recognize that, I'm on autopilot because I always say this thing. And that's important, just to kind of be, I think, present and in the moment, to not repeat yourself with people.
Another one is the energy being reciprocated. Like, if it's super one-sided, and if you notice all your relationships are really one-sided, you calling to vent, you calling to cry, you calling to overshare, then that's another sign. If people aren't meeting your energy, or like those synchronistic meetings when you meet folks and you can talk about really deep things, even though you might not be super close, that's beautiful, but not all relationships are like that. Just so being aware.
Yeah, so in general, I would say if you feel that you may have an issue with oversharing, venting, or trauma dumping, definitely make sure that's something that you bring up with a therapist. Maybe do some Googles, do some research, think about some different things that might help you. Maybe journaling or getting things out somewhere else may be helpful. Maybe having a conversation with your friends might be helpful. Because going back to the online thing, sometimes also what we do, and I found myself doing this before too, more, again, not super deep stuff, but sometimes you do say stuff online as a release, and you say less to your friends. So you may be avoiding vulnerability, like real vulnerability and real connections, by doing it here, but not here. And so kind of think about that, and like, these are opportunities to connect. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We all have our times and things that we need to talk about, things we're going through, and yet you're striving for connection, but you're scared to be vulnerable. And so bring that all to the same place, and you can have a little bit more comprehensive and complete relationships.
I think that's beautiful. But if you feel like this is you, or you are struggling with oversharing, or has been a thing of the past, we'd love to hear from you at Carlie's Couch on all social media. If any of this stood out, if you have some ways that keep you from oversharing, or even some boundaries you might have in place when people overshare with you, we'd love to hear from you.
And we hope you have a great week.
Peace.